We will be continuing our reading of All Power to the Councils, starting with on page 19, the section entitled "With the Red Flag to Vice-Admiral Souchon" by Cora Artelt. I am also have no German background whatsoever, so I have no clue how to pronounce any of these German words. So you'll have to apologize for my gross mispronunciations, but I'll be doing my best. In late October, we were told that the German fleet should depart for one last desperate battle. In response, the reactivated ombudsman of the sailors declared that no more blood was to be spilt and that the sailing of the fleet had to be prevented under all circumstances. If necessary, the firemen were encouraged to sabotage the boilers. When the reactionary forces got wind of this, they arrested most of the ombudsmen. However, such measures could no longer intimidate us, and we led a successful campaign. The firemen and soldiers prevented the intended slaughter. On October 31st, late at night, the 3rd Navy Squadron arrived at Kiel Harbor. They brought 200 of the arrested soldiers. This only fueled our revolutionary commitment. We were determined to free the sailors. On November 1st, the ombudsman, who had escaped arrest, met at the Union Hall in Kiel. They issued a declaration demanding the immediate release of their arrested comrades. It was decided to hold another meeting at the Union Hall the next day. We announced a magician's show to mislead the authorities. However, the Navy leadership must have been informed about our plans. When we arrived at the building, the gates were guarded by security forces prohibiting all soldiers from entering. Before the start of the show, an army officer appeared on stage and ordered all military personnel to leave the hall and return to their troops instantly. We left the hall, but instead of returning to our troops, we gathered on the drill grounds in the forest and agreed to call a people's and soldiers' meeting there on Sunday, November 3rd. The following evening, the USPD office printed leaflets to announce the meeting. The ombudsman encouraged the Navy crews to leave their ships and barracks early Sunday morning. After the USPD had acted in solidarity with us, I went to the local SPD chapter for support. However, the SPD officials only laughed and asked us whether the suppression of the 1917 Sailors' Revolt had not taught us any lesson. I stood my ground, though, and demanded them to join the meeting. On Sunday morning, thousands of soldiers left their ships and troops. The soldiers' and workers' bitterness was enormous, and it only needed a small spark for an explosion. The commander's office seemed prepared. Hornets and alarm patrols marched through the streets of Kiel and demanded all sailors to return to their troops. No one did. We even used the messengers of the commander's office for our own purposes by following right after them, encouraging the soldiers to join us at the meeting. Many came, along with a big number of ordinary citizens. The drill ground was full of people. I opened the meeting with a speech. I addressed the current situation and demanded the people to act with determination. It seemed that my words reached the audience. The following day, a bourgeois paper in Kiel wrote, quote, "The man with the lion's voice spoke so loud that everyone could hear," unquote. Apart from me, the SPD trade union leader, Gustav Garb, and the ombudsman of the sailors, Kirchhofer, spoke. The crowd came to the unanimous decision to hold a demonstration in Kiel in solidarity with the arrested sailors. The day before the meeting, many more arrests had been made. There were even rumors that some sailors were to be executed by a firing squad. Patrols soon tried to block the demonstration's way, but we could not be stopped. We disarmed the patrols without much problem. The demonstration grew by the minute. Many people joined spontaneously. In front of the Café Kaiser, we suddenly heard machine gun fire. We stopped and made sure that no one had been hit. Then we proceeded. Now, however, the shooters fired directly into the crowd. 40 to 50 people, including women and children, collapsed. 8 of them died, and 29 were badly wounded. The masses were outraged when the murderers, who were under the command of Lieutenant Steinhauser, were not willing to stop shooting even after this bloodbath. A sailor who was at the head of the demonstration leapt forward and hit Steinhauser with his rifle. The murderer had received his punishment. This was the signal for attack. Young sailors and workers stormed towards the machine gunners and caused them to flee. We carried our shot brothers and sisters to the Café Kaiser, where we put the wounded on couches and the dead on the floor. We held hands and pledged to act with unrelenting determination against the perpetrators of this heinous crime and against the warmongers in general. We would not rest until they were forced to stop their dirty work. The hour for a decisive confrontation had come. We had witnessed the spark that made the powder keg explode. The next morning, all of our troops had to report for duty. The Navy commander knew that many units had formed Revolutionary Soldiers' Councils the night before. Our torpedo division had received the order to come without arms. After the usual routine, the commander of the division, Captain Bartles, climbed on a table and gave a speech. He mentioned the demonstration and said that there was a lot of tension in town. He emphasized that a soldier had not concerned himself with politics since he didn't know anything about politics. He closed his speech with the words, "A soldier must obey and a soldier will obey." After he stepped from his table, I felt magically drawn towards it. On the spur of the moment, I jumped on it and gave a speech myself, encouraging the soldiers to elect soldiers' councils. The officers, who tried to pull me down, were instantly disarmed by angry soldiers. Afterwards, we stormed our armories and elected soldiers' councils for all companies. I was elected chairman. We held our first meeting in a dining hall of the torpedo division. During the meeting, a sergeant appeared, telling us that we should present our requests to the commander of the division. We explained to him that we had no requests, only demands. If the commander wanted to talk with us, he knew where to find us. Aware of our determination, the commander deemed it wiser to come. We presented our demands. 1. The immediate end of the war. 2. The abdication of the Hohenzollern. 3. The end of the siege. 4. The release of the arrested sailors of the 3rd Squadron. 5. The release of all the sailors imprisoned in Cell due to their involvement in the revolt of 1917. 6. The release of all political prisoners. 7. The implementation of general, equal, and secret suffrage for men and women. Astonished, the commander of the division said, quote, "But gentlemen, these are all political demands," unquote. I gave him the appropriate answer. He had told us on the barrack yard that we shouldn't concern ourselves with politics. That's why we put our political demands first. After a short while, I was told that the governor wanted to see me right away. We got a car, fetched a red flag from the torpedo boat, the flag was bigger than the car, and prepared our departure. Before we left, I gathered the soldiers on the Kielwick drill ground and told them that they should launch an all-out attack if I was not back within 2 hours, disregarding any possible objections by the SPD. When we arrived at the governor's house, we were met by officers armed to the teeth. They rushed toward our car, demanding furiously how we could stop in front of the governor's house in such appearance. I explained to them that they need not worry because we were invited. Right at that moment, a secretary of the governor appeared, telling the officers to lead Artelt of the 1st Torpedo Division to the governor, Vice-Admiral Souchon. I and my comrades were allowed in without further ado. It was obvious how hard it was for Souchon to negotiate with us. This die-hard militarist was not used to negotiating with simple soldiers. He expected them to obey orders even if that meant killing father, mother, and brother. He welcomed us by saying, quote, "Thank you for your courage to come here," unquote. Before the negotiations began, I asked him whether he acknowledged the elected representatives of the soldiers and whether he was willing to negotiate with us on equal terms. Forced by the circumstances, he said yes. Then I told him that we first had to address the issues that he was actually allowed to decide on. I also told him that it would be a mistake to send land troops against the revolutionary sailors. If this happened, the 2nd Squadron had orders to attack the officers' homes in the neighborhood of Dusternbrook and to burn all the luxury houses to the ground. The governor asked, quote, "But gentlemen, can you take responsibility for attacking women and children?" unquote. I told him that it was in his hands to prevent a bloodbath. If he deemed it appropriate to order infantrymen to shoot at sailors, we deemed it appropriate to respond in any manner we saw fit. Given our unrelenting position, the governor gave us his word not to call in outside troops and to return the units that were already on their way. Furthermore, he informed us that the Representative Nosk and the State Secretary Hausmann were coming to Kiel to negotiate with us. In the evening, we heard that despite the governor's promise, 4 infantry units were approaching. We jumped in our car and drove toward them. We reached them at the post office, talked to them, and explained the situation. Then I ordered them not to shoot at the sailors and to either surrender their weapons or to join the revolution. The infantrymen, like all simple workers and peasants forced into a soldier's uniform without any actual relation to the war, joined our revolutionary movement. The officers were disarmed. Our comrades had been very effective during our absence. They had won over the shipyard division that was stationed at our barracks. This division largely consisted of organized class-conscious workers. Now we had about 30,000 men. This was a strong revolutionary force. Unfortunately, we did not have a revolutionary working class party at the time, which would have been necessary to give the revolutionary movement a clear objective and organizational stability. We more or less depended on ourselves and had no connection to the movement in the rest of Germany. We had to operate in isolation. That specifically reminds me of talking about how necessary it was to break off at the first moment when it was clear that the SPD was not revolutionary in 1914, really. I remember we talked about that in a few of the previous meetings we've had. Our next task was the liberation of the arrested sailors. We summoned our military band and all the revolutionary seamen. We marched to the detention center in Kiel to demand the release of all political prisoners. Accompanied by the chief of Kiel's Court of Justice, I inspected the inmates' lists to see who was in prison for political or disciplinary reasons. We demanded these prisoners be freed immediately. Once I knew who they were, I went with the wardens through the entire detention center, ordered the relevant cells to be opened, and informed each comrade personally about the end of his detention. The joy of the freed sailors cannot be described. They all gathered in the prison's entry hall. Meanwhile, I went outside and told the gathered soldiers that the times of saluting pompous officers was over. Now we ought to salute political prisoners. Everyone agreed enthusiastically. Then, upon my command, the prisoners left the detention center and were received with all the honors to the tunes of the Socialist March and the Internationale. The next day, we drove to the train station to receive Nosk. We had planned a big demonstration on Wilhelmsplatz at which Nosk and I should speak. After Nosk's arrival, I told him clearly that he should not try to merely pursue the interests of the SPD, thereby dividing the movement in Kiel. Hypocritically, he told me that his intention was to collaborate in order to, quote, bring the movement further, unquote. Then we drove to Wilhelmsplatz, where Nosk and I spoke to the crowd. Afterward, there was a conference of the administrators of all Navy units in the big hall of the Union Building. On this occasion, Nosk already dropped his mask. The promises he had given me and the train station seemed forgotten. His first words were, quote, the government has sent me to guarantee amnesty for all rebel leaders, soldiers, and workers involved in the movement if the protests in Kiel are stopped immediately, unquote. His words caused outrage. I interrupted him, stating that an end to the protest was out of question. When Nosk noticed that his tactics did not work, he tried different ones and said that what we needed more than anything right now was peace, rest, work, and bread. After long discussions, the Central Soldiers' Council for all Navy units of the Baltic Sea region was elected. Nosk had proposed himself as a candidate, although he wasn't a soldier. In response, we almost proposed a non-soldier, namely Lothar Popp, the chairman of the local USPD chapter, as a candidate. I was elected chairman. Nosk tried to take control of the revolutionary movement in order to suffocate it. After we had removed the Kaiser's government, Vice-Admiral Souchon, from office, Nosk proposed himself as governor of Kiel. He was appointed, but his powers were not to exceed mine as the chairman of the Central Soldiers' Council. Nosk was not supposed to issue any order without my signature. Dual power. As soon as Nosk realized that the revolutionary fervor of Kiel was not spreading to other regions in the same way, he focused on dividing the soldiers in town and to sabotage the work of the Central Soldiers' Council. His goal was to win time, allowing the counter-revolution to organize a crushing blow against the revolutionary movement. That's the end of that section. If anyone has any thoughts, now would be a good time to stop and do a little discussion, but if not, then I'll just continue to the next section, simply titled Berlin. The Workers' and Soldiers' Uprising reached the capital, Berlin, some days after the Wilhelmshaven and Kiel revolts. By November 9, it had become clear that the Kaiserreich was not to survive. Not everyone in the SPD was excited about this. Some of the most prominent SPD members, Chairman Friedrich Ebert included, feared a radical transformation of German society. They were hoping for a constitutional monarchy that would strengthen the powers of the parliament. However, when tens of thousands of workers and soldiers marched on the Reichstag on November 9, it was obvious that more drastic measures were expected. Fearing that radicals, mainly Karl Liebknecht and the Spartacus League, would benefit from the revolutionary situation, cabinet member Philipp Scheidemann stepped out on the balcony of the Reichstag and, against Ebert's explicit wishes, proclaimed Germany a republic. Kaiser Wilhelm II, away in Belgium, was notified after the act and officially abdicated his throne on November 28th. The situation in Berlin was confusing. Only hours after Schiedmann had proclaimed Germany a republic, Karl Liebknecht proclaimed Germany a quote-unquote socialist republic at the Stadtschloss, or city palace, the Berlin residence of the royal family. The revolutionary stewards, fearless anti-war organizers in the factories during the war, took on the role of mediators and called for a big meeting of workers' and soldiers' councils at the Circus Busch on the evening of November 10. At the meeting, it was agreed that an executive council of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils of Great Berlin and a 6-member council of People's Delegates should serve as a provisional government. Both bodies should be equally divided between SPD and USPD members. At the time, the Spartacus League members still belonged to the USPD. The People's Delegates were Friedrich Ebert, Philipp Scheidemann, and Otto Landsberg for the SPD, and Hugo Haas, Wilhelm Dittmann, and Emil Barth for the USPD. According to the agreements at the Circus Busch meeting, the People's Delegates were to act as little else but the administrative arm of the Executive Council. That thus never translated into reality, with the People's Delegates soon assuming many independent powers became one of the main points of contention during the following weeks. It soon became very clear that the SPD's ideas of the new Germany differed significantly from those of the USPD, especially the Spartacists, and also from those of the revolutionary stewards, many of whom were USPD members. The crucial question became the convocation of a National Assembly. The SPD wanted to have a National Assembly elected as soon as possible. For many USPD members, the Spartacus League, the revolutionary stewards, this meant a betrayal of the soldiers and workers and of the chance to build a political and economic system resting on the power of their councils. Although the political vision of the radicals was not uniform, some USPD members were far more willing to make compromises with parliamentarianism than, for an example, the Spartacists. They all agreed that the revolution had to be secured before any steps towards parliamentarism could be taken. That meant they wanted to disarm the bourgeoisie, to break the power of the military, to democratize the press, to redistribute wealth, to socialize the bigger industries, to stabilize international relations, etc. If these measures were not taken, parliamentarism meant nothing but bourgeois capitalist rule. When the so-called Christmas clashes of 1918 made it clear that the USPD did not hesitate to collaborate with the bourgeoisie and reactionary military forces to suppress radical workers' uprisings, the USPD People's Delegates resigned and 2 more SPD members entered the Council of People's Delegates, one of them being Gustav Noske, who was appointed Minister of the Reichswehr. Upon his appointment, Noske allegedly said, quote, "One has to be the bloodhound. I'm ready," unquote. In the following 2 years, he earned notoriety for ruthlessly employing reactionary security forces to quell radical workers' rebellions and uprisings across Germany. In January 1919, the so-called Spartacus Uprising took place. It was a rather spontaneous revolt by frustrated workers, peaking on January 5 in the occupation of many newspaper offices, including the Social Democratic Vorwärts. 6 days later, the occupations were ended by Army and Reactionary Free Corps units sent by Noske. Over 150 workers died in the clashes. The term Spartacus Uprising is misleading. Neither was the uprising planned by the Spartacists, nor were their leaders actively involved. Nonetheless, the uprising was used as an excuse by the SPD to clamp down on the communist rivals. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were lynched on January 15th by reactionary soldiers. This was a crucial moment for the defeat of the radical forces in the revolution. In Berlin, there was one more battle between radicals and the SPD and its allies in March 1919, in which about 2,000 people were killed and in which the SPD government prevailed. After that, social democratic, that was, in the eyes of the radicals, bourgeois rule was secured in the capital. This chapter is divided into 2 parts, gathering text by the most prominent representatives of the 2 main radical factions active in Berlin. Richard Müller and Ernst Daumig were leading figures among the revolutionary stewards, radical labor organizers who had earned deep trust among the proletariat by organizing various strikes during the war. Müller had been imprisoned several times In his book, From the Kaiserreich to the Republic, he writes the following about the revolutionary stewards' history. You can find many misleading reports about the group of revolutionary men that united under the name, quote-unquote, revolutionary stewards. The revolutionary stewards, as they existed on the eve of the revolution, were not the product of a clever leader's mind, but had developed from the social, political, and military conditions in Germany during the war. Its organizational foundation was based on the development of German workers' movement. It all began right after the outbreak of the war, with a meeting of trade union organizers who still took the original social democratic teachings seriously and saw it as their duty to educate the workers and to end the war as soon as possible. In the beginning, the circle was limited to a few people organizing Berlin's iron and metal workers. However, they soon organized concrete actions in support of their goals. It took less than a year for the circle to widen and to extend to other sectors of the war industry. It also spread from Berlin to other parts of the country. The trade unions and the emerging USPD were used as organizational platforms, while ideological affinity existed not only with the USPD but also with the SPD's left wing and the Spartacus League. The Revolutionary Stewards were no mass organization in which everyone could partake, but a selected circle of men educated and experienced in daily politics and workplace struggles, men with an influence in the workplace. They were a quote-unquote vanguard of the proletariat, in the true meaning of the word. The Revolutionary Stewards have perhaps been the most overlooked faction in the German Revolution. The work they did in the shops and factories was enormously important for the radicalization of wide sections of the proletariat. A recent book dedicated to Richard Müller carries the subtitle, quote, "The Man Behind the November Revolution," unquote. This is certainly a bold claim, but it is not entirely unjustified. The texts by Müller and Daumig reflect on the developments of the revolution, the role of the workers' and soldiers' councils, and the potential of the council system. The second part of the chapter is mainly dedicated to articles written by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in the Die Rote Fahne, covering the period from the beginning of the revolution to their death. The articles constitute a kind of Spartacus diary about the revolution's development. They are supplemented by the memories of Spartacus member Karl Retzlaff. In comparison to the Revolutionary Stewards, the Spartacus are well known internationally, not least due to their popularity of Rosa Luxemburg's writing. At times, this leads to exaggerating the Spartacists' role in the German Revolution. However, that they were a crucial force is without doubt. Now, this is an article called The Revolutionary Stewards, so a report by the Executive Council of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils of Great Berlin by Richard Müller. The Executive Council of Berlin has been strongly criticized across the country. The most incredible rumors and many alleged quote-unquote facts have been spread. For weeks, the bourgeois press has been mobilizing against us in unscrupulous ways. Unfortunately, some socialist journals were not only involved in this, I will prove this later on, but were among the driving forces. The first accusation was that the Executive Council of Berlin was aiming to establish a dictatorship and that it wanted to bring the entire country under its control. When these allegations and others that were similarly ludicrous could not be defended, a general defamation campaign began. Comrades, let us investigate the causes for the defamation of the Executive Council. First, we have to look at its origins. In fact, we have to go back even further and look at the events preceding the revolution. Only very few know exactly what happened, and it was not our intention to present it all in detail here. I can tell you, however, that the preparations for the revolution already started in July 1916. At the time, neither the exact goal nor the time was clear, but it was evident to all individuals involved that Germany's political and economic development during the war would bring about a revolution. These individuals have, for the most part, become members of the Executive Council. This was the first reason why the bourgeoisie, never keen on radical social transformations and angry at losing its power to the workers and soldiers, turned against it. Many of the attacks were directed at individual Executive Council members, particularly me. I do not consider myself overly sensitive, but what a bourgeois paper wrote just yesterday really went too far. I will address this later in my speech. The second reason for the attacks on the Executive Council lies deeper. It concerns the fact that the Executive Council and the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils it represents are, in fact, the only tangible results of the revolution. The revolution overthrew the old governmental system, and the power of the state is now contained in the workers' and soldiers' councils that took its place. The domination of the imperialist and bourgeoisie has been undermined. The new order rests on the shoulders of the workers' and soldiers' councils, and it is their task to ensure social and political developments living up to socialist ideas and principles. The Executive Council of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils of Great Berlin has implemented as a provisionary central organ of the German Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, and it was recognized as such. It became the revolution's visible expression. Otherwise, everything remained the same. The entire political and economic life is the same, only that the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils embodied in the Executive Council represent the sovereignty of the state. Therefore, it is not surprising that the ones who have lost power, that is, the bourgeois parties and their press, are focusing their anger on the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils and on the Executive Council in particular. Right after the revolution, this was not so obvious. The press was intimidated. It probably feared the power of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils. But when it became clear that the danger was not that big and that the councils demonstrated sheepish patience, the defamations began and became worse by the day. This was a natural phenomenon. Those who want to reestablish the old order must remove the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, and therefore they must fight them with tooth and nail. It is crystal clear that the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils are the only real achievement of the revolution. If they fall, not much remains of it. Those who fight the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils want, consciously or unconsciously, to reestablish the old order and to take the political power from the workers and soldiers. The fight against the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils is a logical consequence of the present conditions. We, the members of the Executive Council, have contributed to the escalation of the fight. By revolutionary force, we declared ourselves the highest political authority in Germany on November 11. We demanded that all communal, regional, national, and military boards worked under the control of the orders of the Executive Council. At the time, no one objected, and we proceeded to formulate our political guidelines on November 17. These guidelines must have frightened the reactionary forces. We declared, quote, "Workers and soldiers have removed the old governmental system. In the revolutionary organization of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, the new state power is taking shape. This power must be secured and expanded so that the achievements of the revolution will benefit the entire working class. This cannot happen by transforming the German state into a bourgeois democratic republic. The German state has to become a proletarian republic on the grounds of a socialist economy. The wish of the bourgeoisie to elect and install a national assembly as soon as possible is destined to rob the workers of the fruits of the revolution." Unquote. The resolution of November 17 said with all clarity that we wanted to maintain and secure the achievements of the revolution, that we would not allow anyone to take them away, and that the political power had to remain in the hands of the manual and intellectual workers and soldiers. And, of course, the soldiers, even if the soldiers' councils are only a temporary phenomenon, as they will soon vanish. We also spoke out very clearly against the National Assembly. However, I do not want to say much about this now. We will discuss this later, according to the Congress schedule. In any case, it was inevitable that our stance would provoke the enemies of the revolution to come out and fight. Comrades, before I will report more on the activities of the Executive Council and on the activities and the identity of its adversaries, I would like to quickly recall its origins. The revolution took its first steps outside of Berlin, especially at the North Sea coast. Ironically, we who had prepared for the revolution had already determined our first move when the news from the revolutionary uprising in other parts of Germany reached us. The insane plan of the old rulers to send our entire navy fleet with tens of thousands of our best sons into a last desperate battle against England under the motto, quote, "to win or to perish with dignity," unquote, was revealed at the right time and prevented. It led to the outbreak of the revolution before we in Berlin could even conceive it. On November 19, the revolution reached Berlin itself. The day before, masses of soldiers arrived in the city. It seemed that the imminent uprising was to be suppressed by arms. The bourgeois press, including the Vorwärts, did everything to prevent open rebellion. In the morning edition of November 9, the Vorwärts urged Berlin's workers not to go on strike before all means of negotiation were exhausted. But the revolutionary sentiments had already become too strong. The old rulers did not have the courage to fight for their chartered rights. As it had to be expected, November 9 was a very chaotic day. We had not foreseen that the old rulers would leave their posts so quickly in the midst of the chaos. Those who had prepared for the revolution tried to uphold some kind of order, and it was them who, on November 10th, called for a meeting of the delegates of Berlin's workers and soldiers' councils in Circus Busch. In the meantime, the two social democratic parties collaborated in forming a government, the Council of People's Delegates, which was composed in equal parts of members of the SPD and USPD. This council was approved at the provisionary government in Circus Busch. At the same time, however, the executive council was elected. Born from the revolution, the workers' and soldiers' councils that formed all across the country were the carriers of the revolution, and we, as the Executive Council of Great Berlin, saw ourselves as essential council of workers' and soldiers' councils of all Germany. We were convinced that it was necessary to form a central council for Germany. The German Socialist Republic needed a central political organ, a defender of the sovereignty of the working masses. On this basis, we published the declaration that I cited above, putting all regional, national, military, etc. boards under our control and asserting our central role in administering the country. Given the rapid developments, it was always clear that our measures could only be provisionary. We never said anything else. We always emphasized that our power was provisionary and that a different body appointed by a broader electorate should take place as soon as possible. Given the role that the Executive Council played, I understand that it might have appeared as we wanted to establish a dictatorship over the entire country. Unfortunately, our opponents exploited this fear. They convinced many Germans that this was indeed our intention. However, we never had any such intention, and we never proclaimed anything of that kind either. It is discouraging that even socialist journals spread this lie, nonetheless undermining the trust of the workers' and soldiers' councils across Germany in the Executive Council of Great Berlin. If you, honored comrades, look at the documents that have been handed to you, you also find the membership list of the Executive Council. This list proves that the Executive Council was widened as far as possible. Today, there are no longer 28 but 45 members. This, I believe, is clear proof that the members of the original Executive Council never intended to concentrate the power of the state in their own hands. The Executive Council of Great Berlin constituted itself as the highest authority in the country at a time when the entire political system had been uprooted and the economy came to a halt, or at least when such a halt seemed imminent. In other words, at a time when public peace and security were endangered and when counter-revolutionary coups had to be expected any day. Comrades, you may criticize us as much as you want. You may tell us that we could have done many things better. We know this. However, no one can accuse us of not having tried, and no one can question our goodwill. The difficulties we were facing were enormous. Whenever we did not make the changes we should have made, we simply weren't strong enough. Comrades, consider one thing. During this time, we received hundreds of telegrams and letters from all over Germany every day. We were virtually besieged by people who were looking for our advice and our help. In addition, we had no technological infrastructure and no public servants who were trained and experienced. It should not come as a surprise that under these circumstances, several Executive Council members collapsed under the amount of work and responsibility. You must also remember that the situation in Berlin was very different from the one in most parts of the country. The seat of the national government was here, the seat of the Prussian government, the seat of the Ministry of War, the General Staff, of all military authorities, of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and of basically all governmental offices. Furthermore, the headquarters of the highly influential companies profiting from the war were here. Everyone approached us and demanded our attention after we had become the highest authority in the country overnight. In addition, we had to keep an eye on the soldiers and workers in order to guarantee peace and order among them. If you consider this, you must admit the impossibility for everything to go smoothly. It should therefore be understandable if certain things have happened that could normally not be excused. In addition, the soldiers who became part of the Executive Council had not been selected as carefully as they should have been. There were people among them who should have never belonged to the Executive Council. Fortunately, the entire Executive Council had to take responsibility for their mistakes. Let me say a bit more about the relationship between the Council of People's Delegates and the Executive Council. I state openly, quote, "Eventually the relationship became unbearable. I only want to point out one thing. It appears as if the Council of People's Delegates no longer wants to accept the power of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils at all." During the counter-revolutionary coup of December 6th, the message was clear. The government Ebert Haas was acceptable, but not the Executive Council. The coup was directed against the achievements of the revolution. The Executive Council falls, the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils will fall too. I was also astonished to see troops pledging allegiance to the Council of People's Delegates, but not the Executive Council or the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils in general. The words used were the following, quote, "We pledge in the name of the units we represent to defend and protect the United German Republic and its provisional government, the Council of People's Delegates," unquote. However, it is clear that the sovereignty of the people is represented in the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils. These are bodies soldiers should pledge allegiance to. Instead, they pledged allegiance to the, quote, "German Republic," unquote. Note that it was not the, quote, "German Socialist Republic," unquote. There is a difference. Some might think that there is none. I don't. Comrades, I have already pointed out that in our declaration of November 11th, the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils and their highest organ, the Executive Council, were recognized as the carriers of political sovereignty in Germany. The troops must pledge allegiance to the highest power of the state. If they don't, it only proves that some are trying to dismantle the revolution's achievements. We deemed a thorough reform of the entire reactionary government apparatus our first duty, but the Council of People's Delegates did not support us. To the contrary, we have had nothing but problems with the Council of People's Delegates. Right after the revolution, we negotiated the division of powers and duties. The negotiations weren't easy. It was not the fault of the Executive Council that it needed 5 days to come to an agreement. You find the result in the documents presented to you under number 25. These are the constitutional duties of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils and the People's Delegates laid out in 5 points. 1. The political power lies in the hands of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils in the German Socialist Republic. It is our duty to maintain and to expand the achievements of the revolution and to suppress the counter-revolution. 2. Until an assembly of delegates of Workers' and Soldiers' Councils has elected an Executive Council of the German Socialist Republic, the Executive Council of Great Berlin fulfills this role. 3. The Workers' and Soldiers' Councils of Great Berlin appoints a cabinet and transfers certain powers to it. 4. The right to appoint and dismiss cabinet members lies with the Executive Council, which also monitors the work of the cabinet. This also applies to the government of Prussia until the relationship between the German Socialist Republic and Prussia will be clarified. 5. If the cabinet wants to appoint special ministers, they have to be approved by the Executive Council. In the negotiations, we stated clearly, and rightfully, I would like to emphasize, that the Executive Council had to retain the right to act on its own in case of imminent counter-revolutionary danger. In fact, this did not only apply to the Executive Council, but also to all local Workers' and Soldiers' Councils. While we had transferred governing powers to the cabinet, we insisted on maintaining control over them. I still believe that this was the only option we had. Let me ask you clearly, when the cabinet disregarded all our resolutions, what were we supposed to do? We could have only removed it by a motion of no confidence. To be honest, our influence on the government has all but disappeared since those days. The cabinet has simply ignored all of the Executive Council's resolutions and proposals. Increasingly, the relationship is turning into one of competition rather than collaboration. Comrades, what are we supposed to do when we are told that soldiers returning from the front and still strongly influenced by the officers we cannot trust are equipped with arms and ammunition at the gates of Berlin? We must demand from the Council of People's Delegates to stop this and to ensure that the ammunition is returned. Comrades, these are only some of the obstacles we have met when trying to push the revolution further, or at least securing its revolutionary achievements. The People's Delegates have regularly turned against us. If you consider the speeches given by Ebert and Scheidman yesterday, it is obvious that the Council of People's Delegates never felt comfortable with the role of the Executive Council and that it has always attempted to act on its own. If you support this, you contribute to the undermining of the revolutionary authority, that is, the Executive Council as the central council of workers and soldiers' councils, and therefore also to the undermining of the revolution's achievements. There is no point in closing our eyes. We have to describe the situation honestly. Comrades, the government of the people's delegates is fully supported by the bourgeois press. There is no doubt the Executive Council has been defamed in the worst ways. Leaflets have been distributed in which the Executive Council is held responsible for everything, even the mistakes of the rotten fallen regime. Everyone points at the Executive Council saying, quote, "Soldiers, you who have defended the fatherland for 4 years against a superior enemy, free the German people from this abscess." Unquote. It is clear that campaigns like these have effects. While we are defamed, the counter-revolution organizes and mobilizes. This led to the coup of December 6th. We have had heated discussions about this in the Executive Council and with the Council of People's Delegates. I will not go into details, but I want to say one thing. Convinced that I have most of the Executive Council members on my side. I was very alienated by the behavior of the People's Delegates during the coup. The coup came from the right. The coup came from the left. The coup from the left is not as bad as some here might imagine. We know all the instigators of the coup and have proof. All these counter-revolutionary leaders are free men today. They can do the same thing again. The main conspirator, Captain Lorenz from the Ministry of War, has been released upon orders from his superior, the minister. Comrade Barth has told me on the telephone that the Ministry of War insists on conducting the investigation against Captain Lorenz itself. If Comrade Barth now tells me that a special commission has been formed to handle the case, then I ask why this commission did not exist when Captain Lorenz was released. This was the reason why the entire cabinet was put into question, because no one could understand how a person with so much evidence against him could be set free. Now Lorenz can continue to organize the White Guards that might remove the last of the revolution's achievements. I could continue with examples illustrating the relationship between the Council of People's Delegates and the Executive Council, but I won't. I think I have already illustrated sufficiently how difficult it is for the Executive Council to do its work, how it meets new challenges every day, and how it has to struggle against both natural and unnatural enemies. The Executive Council and all the workers' and soldiers' councils are children of the revolution. No child grows up without teething troubles. The Executive Council and all of the workers' and soldiers' councils had to experience the same. But how do these problems compare to the horror of the old regime? We have been accused of wasting national assets. In 6 weeks, the Executive Council has spent 500,000 marks, almost exclusively for urgent matters that needed to be taken care of. Compare this to the old regime that has wasted 2/3 of Germany's national wealth. Those who accused us of wasting national assets have unscrupulously approved and sacrificed billions and billions of marks for the slaughtering of human beings. They have no right at all to complain about the alleged waste of money by the workers' and soldiers' councils. We have clean hands. These lies and defamations will have no effect on the activities of the councils. At the same time, comrades, the attacks on the Executive Council and on the workers' and soldiers' councils in general have harmed us greatly. They have had consequences not only in Germany, but also beyond. Abroad, people believe that anarchy reigns in Germany since the workers' and soldiers' councils have taken over. The workers' and soldiers' councils are the target of the counter-revolution. If they crumble, then the last achievement of the revolution crumbles as well. This will not least be the fault of those who have used the inevitable mistakes that the workers' and soldiers' councils have made to discredit them. The Congress may give the right answer. We, the members of the Executive Council, have tried to secure the achievement of the revolution. We failed. Today, these achievements are in great danger. I admit that the Executive Council was composed in an unfortunate manner. Things have changed, though, which pleases me. My friends and I have tried to secure the revolution. The problem was never a lack of will. Unfortunately, the circumstances were sometimes stronger than us. Even today, and I ask you to consider this, as I have had to consider it ever since the outbreak of the revolution, all political questions remained, in the end, questions of power. Comrades, you have to make a decision. Don't look back. Look forward. We have hard times behind us. We have had unpleasant experiences, and we look to the future with worries. Now, however, the fate of the revolution is in your hands, and we hope and wish you can secure its achievements and expand it even further.